Africa, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the ancient city of Carthage, the heights of Bandiagara, Victoria Falls, Dalol Volcano, Baobab of Sunland, Mount Masia Harsine or Sacred Peak. Ancient civilizations, vast reserves of valuable minerals, incredible landscapes, and rare species of animals. On the other hand, don't go wandering into Africa, kids, to the horror of moms and grandmas, motivating the eating of tasteless porridge by mentioning starving African children. And the older we get, the more it's not the rivers of such width and mountains of such height that come to the fore, but various atrocities like Emperor Cannibal Bacchus, or events like the massacre in Rwanda. Most often, people's perception of Africa is a wild mix of news report snippets, a weak grade in geography at school, and some wild tales from yellow and same-colored websites. As a result, the entire continent is perceived as a sheer mass of civil wars, starving children, military coups, epidemics, and cannibalism. Not to say that all the listed troubles have a particular deficit, but still, they do not occur everywhere and not always. What prevented the peoples of the Black Continent from developing to the level of other continents? Someone will say that it's the arid climate and isolation from the rest of the world. Someone will say that the easier it is for people to survive, the less motivation they have to drive progress. Someone will mention the slave-owning system and external influence. In this video, we will try to answer the eternal question, why is Africa still poor? It's no secret that Africa is rich in natural, land, and human resources. The Black Continent contains colossal deposits of mineral resources, manganese, bauxite, chromite, fuel resources, cobalt and copper ores, gold, platinum, diamonds, phosphates, uranium, and many other useful resources. Such countries as Nigeria, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and some others are among the top 5 world leaders in the extraction of precious metals, oil, and gas. The total area of Africa is almost 30 million square kilometers. Despite the abundance of deserts and semi-deserts, arable lands that can be used in agriculture make up 9 million square kilometers. This is slightly larger than Brazil's total land area. Agriculture is the basis of the economy for the majority of African countries. Theoretically, with similar resources, African countries could become the richest regions in the world. Of course, we are talking about so-called Black Africa, not its north, which is part of the Mediterranean, where the great and ancient Egyptian civilization appeared in antiquity, and where one of the greatest African colonies, Carthage, was located. The lag of Africa in the civilizational plan today is greatly exaggerated in popular consciousness, if you consider the history of the continent as a whole. At certain stages of history, Africans not only did not lag behind, but also overtook Europeans in development. For example, there was never a Bronze Age in Africa. Producing bronze was simply not possible. So from the Stone Age, Africans jumped straight into the Iron Age. In Africa, there were many states that were quite developed by medieval standards, little different from their European contemporaries in terms of socio-economic development. The brightest example is the Mali Empire, which later transformed into the Songhai Empire. These state formations existed for centuries. Inclusively, in the south of Africa, from the 13th to the 19th century, the Monomotapa Empire existed. Meanwhile, as early as the 10th century, Arab merchants and travelers wrote about a highly developed and gold-rich state in the south of the continent. Another example is Ethiopia, more known in antiquity as the Kingdom of Aksum. It is enough to say that Aksum was one of the first Christian states in the history of the earth. These are far from all examples, but they give an idea that chronically backward Africa is a stereotype. After all, different peoples began their history in different geographical conditions. Geography in a broad and narrow sense, climate in particular, availability of cultural plants and domestic animals, availability of river routes, and much more. This is what forms human society, not some exception. Cultural and psychological characteristics of peoples are created by those same fundamental factors, most of which do not depend on people at all. But what still pulled Africa into its current state? The climate. The pleasant climate of Africa is greatly overestimated. We are used to perceiving Africa as something unified and whole, but in reality, the climate here varies greatly from region to region. Even if we don't talk about the Sahara Desert, it's not much better in the rest of Africa. On the western coast, there is an oceanic desert climate. In the center is a continental, moderately arid, and on the east, a maritime monsoon. Thus, even the most favorable regions of Africa are arid and extremely difficult for agriculture. Sahara. The Sahara Desert, the mysteries of which we talked about in one of our past issues, is not just an ocean of sand. It's a black hole from a logistics point of view. Traveling through the Sahara is an adventure that has seriously hindered both trade between Africa and the rest of the world and migration since ancient times. Where there is no intense migration and trade, there is no exchange of technologies and culture. Today, many people do not fully understand how strongly Europe and Asia have been culturally and technologically connected since ancient times. The vast contribution to mutual development in its time was made by the spiderweb of trade routes, known as the Great Silk Road. Inhabited Africa, on the other hand, was almost completely isolated from the rest of the world for a long time. Epidemics and deadly pests. Nowhere else on planet Earth will you find so many remarkable living organisms trying to kill you, as you will find them on the African continent. Only Australia can probably compete in the abundance of life that can be found in the most unexpected places, but that's a separate topic. Throughout the entire history of the demography of the African continent, besides the risks of farming, various epidemics have consistently undermined it. So it happened that neither in Europe nor in Asia was there its own tsetse fly with sleeping sickness. Epidemics undoubtedly occurred everywhere. However, it is specifically in Africa where they remain a chronic problem to this day. And there are also tapeworms the size of a snake, malaria mosquitoes, black mambas, Nile crocodiles, fat-tailed scorpions, and a multitude of other interesting creatures that are not very happy to meet a human. But before malaria appeared, the Africans woke up something else in the jungles. This discovery almost knocked malaria off its pedestal and went down in history as one of the most horrifying ways to die. Ships arriving in the New World would sometimes raise a yellow flag with a skull and crossbones, and no one dared to board, no matter how valuable the cargo they carried. The infection decimated entire cities, becoming the basis for many grim legends about vanished colonies, places of African slaves, and their cursed gods. Yellow Jack, Bronze John, Bloody Flux, or simply yellow fever, a viral hemorrhagic disease of the New World. Yellow fever spread everywhere, predominantly striking the poorest regions. Europeans invented the vaccine only in the 1930s, not without the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, which allocated huge sums for the fight against yellow fever. But beyond domestic territories, the problem, of course, was not solved and still poses a threat in Africa. Ebola, Lassa fever, Marburg, and West Nile fall into the same category. Colonization. Here we are, getting to the main point. The development of African states seriously undermined the acquaintance with civilized Europeans, who for several centuries turned the continent into a source of cheap resources and slave labor. It all ended with the fact that the entire African continent was divided among the leading states of the Old World at that time. Over the centuries, the colonial yoke has oppressed Africa and increasingly pushed the continent into backwardness, effectively keeping local society not even at a feudal, but at a tribal level of development. It all started at the end of the century, and there were several reasons for this. Europe learned about quinine, produced from the bark of the South American cinchona tree, capable of curing malaria, which was no longer so scary for European settlers. Europe developed edged weapon technology, which had huge advantages over the smoothbore musket, which the most advanced African armies were equipped with. Europe amassed enough information about Inner Africa thanks to a whole cohort of brave travelers who successfully made their way through jungles, swamps, deserts, and proved that the sun there does not burn a person alive, as ancient authors suggested. Finally, Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution and was in dire need of new markets to absorb factory goods, which were being produced at an unprecedented speed and in large volumes. For the start of the colonial and guns, all that was needed was to make the first shot. It was not the great powers that were destined to make it, but little Belgium. This shot was fired in 1876 in Brussels, when the Belgian King Leopold announced the creation of the African International Association for the Advancement of Scientific and Humanitarian Projects in the Congo River Basin. Throughout Europe, this step was taken as the beginning of the Belgians' conquest of Central Africa. And so it was in reality. In its harsh exploitation of the local population on the rubber plantations, mines, and road construction organized by the Belgians, nothing like it was known in the history of Africa, and people were dying by the tens of thousands, and yet the repression and looting remained unchecked. Because the Free State of Congo, as this vast territory was cynically called, was not governed by the Belgian state, but was the personal property of Leopold. England, France, Portugal, and Spain immediately followed Belgium. After a short wait to the suddenly fashionable division of the African pie, the young great powers of Germany and Italy joined, also dreaming of their own colonial empires. The storm gained hurricane speed. All over Africa, where it was possible to negotiate with tribal leaders or break the resistance of local principalities, the European flag was quickly hoisted, and the territory was considered annexed to the empire. It cannot be said that this lightning division of the continent passed the colonizers without losses. The English had to go through several bloody battles to capture the Ashanti Confederation in Ghana and the Zulu state in South Africa, while the French overcame the stubborn resistance of the Emirates in Fula and the Tuaregs in Mali. Over 2 years, the German forces had to suppress the Herero uprising in Namibia, which ended in a large-scale genocide of Africans. Over 350 years, European slave traders caused immense harm to Africa. Millions of Africans were transported to work on American plantations or died during capture and transportation. The likelihood and colonization of the territories of Africa, Eurasia, and America by Europeans was all the easier, as the people inhabiting these territories were decimated. European colonizers brought with them alcohol, which was a very profitable commodity, with profits ranging from 400 to 900%. It was sold to the New World in exchange for practically everything from wood to slaves. In West Africa, alcohol, especially rum, became an integral part of the Golden Triangle, that is, the trade scheme. Rum from America, slaves from Africa, sugar cane from West Indies. Although by the 19th century, the African continent had turned into a patchwork quilt, colored by the colors of European empires, Tanganyika, the territory of present-day Tanzania, was subjugated by Germany only in the 19th century, and France secured control over West Africa no earlier than the 19th century. The liberation struggle of Libyan tribes against the Italians continued until the year 1922, and the Spaniards managed to pacify the warring Berbers of Morocco only in the year 1926. Only one state, created by Africans, managed to maintain its independence: Ethiopia. At the end of the century, Ethiopian Negus Menelik even managed to participate in the division of Africa, more than doubling the borders of his state at the expense of various tribes in the south, west, and east. The colonizers really built some kind of modern economy in Africa, although its scales compared to the scales of traditional farming were not very large. They stopped intertribal wars, ended cannibalism, which flourished in the central part of the continent, opened a certain number of schools and hospitals, taught some Africans in universities. However, they did not turn the population of the colonies into civilized, independent people. Africans were taught to obey white masters, but this does not make a savage a civilized person, nor a former slave free. There were very few educated people and qualified specialists in Africa by the end of the colonial period, but most importantly, neither the elites nor the masses of the population were accustomed to making decisions, considering their consequences. and taking responsibility for their implementation. Influence of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. By mid-century, Africa remained the continent with the poorest range of colors on the political map. 60% of its territory was dominated by two colors: violet, representing France's colonial rule, and green, marking this or that form of the region's affiliation with the British Empire. The decolonization process that started post-World War II faced challenges. The old European states were only parting with those lands that, obviously, they could not hold on to. Great Britain was no longer able to suppress the Indian independence movement, and France could not maintain control in Indochina. However, London and Paris believed that they had the necessary resources to prolong their stay on the African continent. In the worst case, they could retreat, replacing direct colonial rule with indirect forms of control over the economic and political life of the new states. For the first time, the Soviet Union shook this conviction. Decolonization served his core interests. By breaking up the unity of the capitalist camp, it opened the socialist path of development for the peoples of Africa. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, European colonial empires tried to force the Egyptian government, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, to abandon the nationalization of the Suez Canal and, with the support of Israel, waged war against Egypt. But their first military success was put to an end. In its official statement, Moscow decisively condemned the aggression and threatened the English and French with serious consequences, up to providing direct military assistance to Cairo. London and Paris had to back down. The whole world became convinced that the power of the European empires remained in the past. Throughout the entire Black Continent, the liberation movement was gaining momentum, actively supported by Moscow. By the end of the 1950s, Morocco and Tunisia had gained independence from France, quickly establishing diplomatic relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics helped thousands in 1960. The year became truly the year of Africa. It was then that 17 countries of the Black Continent gained independence from their colonial masters. In the same year, at the initiative of the Soviet Union, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. The declaration was approved by an overwhelming majority of votes, with 9 abstentions, including the very colonial powers, as well as the United States of America. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics invested billions of dollars in the struggle of African countries for independence and for their choice of a socialist path of development, and massively supplied weapons to the Black Continent. For example, the Somali army had T-34 and T-54-55 tanks, Il-28 bombers, and MiG-21, 17, and 19 fighters. Outdated equipment in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was replaced with new ones, and in exchange for credits, equipment, and weapons, Moscow received raw materials and various goods. Natural rubber, bauxites, roll of black metals, cotton, silk, leather raw materials, tea, cocoa beans, fabrics, sugar were sent to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from African countries. The collapse in the early 90s began a stage of deepest transformations in the global balance of power, which, of course, could not but affect the African continent. And this opened the next new stage of competitive struggle for Africa. The main contender for the African legacy turned out to be the United States of America. The states usually tied their financial aid to the fulfillment of strict mandatory conditions. This includes adherence to democratic principles by the government, free elections guaranteeing the changeability of power, the fight against corruption, respect for human rights, freedom of the press, gender equality, tolerance, and so on. Did it work? In most cases, no. A somewhat successful example could only be United Arab Republic. China and India, in their turn, and specifically these two countries today, have a large and growing influence in Africa, following a different model of strengthening their influence on the continent, which is sometimes referred to in the press as Asian soft power or Asian soft power. Offering African countries large projects, they do not impose any strict political conditions, preferring not to interfere in the internal affairs of states. They do not prioritize the situation with freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They do not demand fair and free elections. Without any such additional conditions, India and China provide very substantial financial and technological assistance to African states, and thus they achieve their strategic goals of deep penetration into Africa more and more successfully. We showed how gently China is swallowing Africa in another of our issues. And now we simply add that China successfully cooperates in unstable African states with practically any political regimes, and is even ready to compromise its political principles. So, recently, China began to help Burkina Faso, despite the fact that this country recognizes the sovereignty of Taiwan. Such a complex of reasons, from climate to foreigners, still does not allow the state of Africa to stand in line with the largest world powers. It's worth remembering that from time to time, someone tries to unite the African countries, moreover, without foreign intervention. Such a person was Muammar Gaddafi, but we remember perfectly well how his attempt to create an African Union ended. So all that remains is to wonder, will the Black Continent finally be able to go its own successful way of development?